All right, everybody, welcome to a new week in our graduate research and design class. It's February 22nd today, and this week goes until the 27th, and the focus is on experimental research and causal comparative research. And so you'll be reading those two chapters about experimental research and causal comparative research and taking the two quizzes on those chapters for this week. And also a proposal description will be due at the end of this week. So you'll have that due as well. But I wanted to introduce a couple of items as we get going. First of all, we've only talked about quantitative research so far. And that's only one half of the full picture, really. There's this other area called qualitative research that we need to talk about and we'll be reading about after spring break, actually. And so your research study can be qualitative research. And if you want to do a qualitative research study, some of you are thinking about this, I know, then you might want to read ahead a little bit to find out what narrative research is, ethnographic research is, and case study research. There are some chapters on these subjects that we'll be reading in the future, but of course you can always read ahead. So your research study that you propose can be qualitative as well, and meaning that you won't necessarily have numbers as results or test scores or measures of quantitative items that can be numbered, but instead you might have things like interviews or observations as part of your research study, and I recognize that some of you would want to do that. Also, I wanted to share just a little bit about some of the types of research studies under quantitative research so that you have a nice little organizing image or concept of how these differ. So here's some quantitative research types as we read about them. There are the 5 types that we're reading about in our book: survey research, correlational research, causal comparative research, experimental research, and single subject experimental research. So survey research is, hopefully you're familiar with, is when you send out some kind of a questionnaire or survey and people can respond to it either through writing things down, marking the answers, or on the computer as is indicated in the picture here. You send it out usually to an entire population or as many people as you can, and in sample survey research you try to get the sample to generalize the sample that you received for the whole population. And in my experience, most recently there's a survey that you're all participating in, not the survey part of it, but a follow-up questionnaire part of it, or interview questions part of it. But my survey research was sent out to 12,000 teachers, got about maybe near 1,200 responses, so I'm trying to make inferences on the population based on the responses that I received, but I certainly did not receive a response from every possible population person, which are South Dakota teachers. So that's the way survey research goes, and you try to make some inferences about the whole population based on what you receive from the surveys. Now remember, correlational research, you're taking 2 variables and you're trying to figure out how they correlate or how they are related in some way. And these 2 variables could come from the same group of people, usually do, or a same group of information. For instance, here on the left we have Texas summers. So June through August average temperatures. As those temperatures are high, we have total rainfall in inches on the bottom. And so if you look, as the temperatures rise, it tends to have less rainfall, or as there is less rainfall, the temperatures are usually higher. And total rainfall in inches, as there is more rainfall, there are usually lower temperatures in Texas summers. So that's a correlational chart. Now you have to remember about causation and correlation, right? You're trying to compare 2 variables and trying to predict what might happen. So based on this diagram here, we could probably predict that the lower the rainfall, the lower the amount of rainfall, the higher the temperatures are going to be on average. So that's a prediction, but it's not a causal chart. It's not saying that necessarily that the rainfall causes the lower temperatures or that the higher temperature or lower temperatures cause the rainfall. It's more of a prediction tool. And same with this one. It says stop global warming, become a pirate, because as they have found out, global warming tends to increase as the amount of pirates in the world decreases. It's a nice little relationship there, right? but certainly the amount of pirates in the world does not cause or change the amount of global average temperature in the world. So it's a reminder to us that correlation is not something that establishes a cause between things. And then causal comparative research is the next type of research. Now remember, you're trying to find a cause if you can, but that's sort of tricky. You can't really always figure out if this is the cause or not. But this is the type of research that you do where you cannot or maybe should not manipulate a variable. And so you find existing groups and compare them on key variables. And then based on what you compare them with, you might be able to make some inferences and might be able to determine somewhat or suggest maybe a cause, but maybe not determine a cause. So for instance, you might be studying people with lung cancer and people without lung cancer and trying to determine what the cause of lung cancer is. And obviously you cannot manipulate whether somebody has lung cancer or not. That wouldn't be ethical to give people lung cancer for one part of your study and have another group that doesn't receive it. But you could figure out maybe some of the causes of it. Maybe you'll find that most of these groups are compared on key variables. They're about the same on everything, but one group tends to smoke a lot and another group does not. And the group without lung cancer doesn't smoke and the group with lung cancer does. And so that might give you an idea of what the cause of lung cancer could be. But it's more of a suggestion rather than a definitive cause when you're finding out things from causal comparative research. The next one that you'll be reading about this week is experimental research, and this is the most strong research for establishing a cause-effect relationship. This is where you manipulate a variable and you randomly assign people to different groups, control and treatment groups, and you try to control for any other variables in that group and then measure the differences between the groups. So you actually might take a population or a group of 100 people, a sample of 100 people, and you might randomly assign 50 to one group and 50 to another group and manipulate one variable for the control group and one variable for the treatment group. And then you can find a measurement that tells you the difference between the two. You have much more control over experimental research as a researcher. And it has the best form of research for establishing cause-effect relationships. One thing also is that quasi-experimental research is another branch off of this, and that is a form of research where you are unable to randomly assign the groups to control and treatment groups. Instead, you have existing groups that you manipulate a variable for. And because they are existing, you lose some of that random assignment, and so you are not able to make as strong inferences based on quasi-experimental research. But a lot of people do that in education because you have people already in certain classes, and so you might have one class, it's already existing, and another class is already existing, and you might manipulate the one class to have a different type of treatment, and that would be quasi-experimental because you did not randomly assign the students to different classes or different groups. And then finally, from quantitative research, we have single subject experimental research. And this is where you have one person or one group, and you expose each person or group is exposed to both control and treatment phases. So one example is our iPad study that we're doing right now, where we have one class. We took some data from the class before introducing iPads and reading comprehension activities with iPads. We took some data from last year, and now we take some data from this year when we have implemented those iPads to the same group. And so we have an opportunity to see whether the changes, if they improve in reading comprehension better this time than they did in the last time. But it's the same group, and they're both exposed to control and treatment phases. So those are the types of research. Hopefully that's helpful for you to remember these different types of research studies that could be done. And hopefully as you think through these, and you can choose one for your own study if you're choosing a quantitative type of study, but of course that wasn't the only type of study you can choose. So you could also choose qualitative. One thing that it mentions also in the book is that we can tell the difference between control and treatment groups with statistical methods. if the differences between the two groups are meaningful or not. We can tell through statistical methods, and so we run some statistical math calculations, and we can determine whether the differences between experimental groups or quasi-experimental groups or correlational or whatever. We use statistical methods for that. Finally, this week, you'll need to submit your proposal description. Now, there's not too much new with this. You either complete task 2A or 2B from the textbook. 2A is for students who are looking into doing a quantitative study for their research proposal, as I outlined the different quantitative methods. And 2B is for students desiring to do a qualitative study. Now, if you're thinking about doing a study that includes both of these elements, I do suggest you go through the quantitative part of this, because then you'll have your instrument set up and then you can add the qualitative things on later, which that would make up a mixed methods study. And it says information on what to do for this task can be found on page 114 of the textbook. And so there is more information, and there's also an example task in the textbook. Although your literature reviews, your preliminary literature reviews, will be added into this, which will be required. So you'll want to make sure that if there's anything missing or any comments that I made on your literature review, you want to see if you can get those updated before this time of handing this in. But it includes introduction, statement of the problem, and statement of the hypothesis after the review of the literature. So you'll include those items in your assignment that you submit by the end of this week, and then I'll grade it with that rubric there. I'll look for introducing the paper, statement of the problem, statement of the hypothesis. And notice that I don't really have anything in there for the review of the literature. Later on we'll have another review of the literature assignment that you'll hand in, and I'll grade then at that point. But do include your literature review for this assignment. And then I look for flow with transitional organizing sentences and paragraphs, APA formatting for the different elements, and then no spelling or grammatical errors. So that's an assignment to be submitted by the end of this week, and I do wish you luck on this week. It's going to be a good one. So have a great week.